For our project, we decided to discuss microaggressions on liberal campuses. The definition of microaggression are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. Dr. Chester Pierce coined the term in 1969. It was originally applied to dismissals and insults towards African Americans from non-Black Americans. It's considered to be the new face of racism because the nature of racism has shifted over time from overt expressions of racial hatred and hate crimes towards expressions of aversive racism, such as microaggressions, that are more subtle, ambiguous, and often unintentional. Sue says that this has led some Americans to wrongly believe that non-white Americans no longer suffer from racism. When people of color stand up to microaggressions, they are often thought to be too sensitive. In 1973, Mary Rowe, an MIT economicist, extended microaggression to include analogous aggression against women. As it stands today, microaggression applies to any casual degradation of marginalized groups such as disabled people, gender, and sexual minorities. According to Daryl Wing Sue, microaggressions seem to appear in three forms. The first form is microassault. This is an explicit racial derogation, and it can be verbal or nonverbal. Examples include name-calling, avoidant behavior, purposeful discriminatory actions. The second one is microinsult. This is communications that convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage or identity. Examples include subtle snubs, unknown to the perpetrator, hidden insulting messages to the recipient of color. The last one is micro-invalidation. These are communications that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person belonging to a particular group. Some examples of microaggressions are, no, where are you really from? What are you? You don't act like a normal Black person. So you don't speak Spanish? Can I touch your hair? You're not really Asian. You're really pretty for a Black girl. Why do you sound so white? I can tell you're Asian because your eyes are squinty. Wow, your English is really good.
In regards to the historical context, we wanted to see how microaggressions in higher education have looked like throughout the country in the past years. And we found a couple of articles. The first one we found is called "The African American Student Network: Creating Sanctuaries and Counter Spaces for Coping with Racial Microaggressions in Higher Education Settings." This article is by Augie Flores. And so it dives into how students experience adversity and experience pressure to conform to stereotypes, as well as unjust treatment from campus staff and faculty compared to their white peers. The article also mentions the fact that African American students experience poorer health and energy and an overall lower satisfaction with their university than white students, and this is also a result of the microaggressions they've experienced. And then as a result, universities need to create sanctuaries or safe spaces for African American students to help them cope with their experiences in predominantly white institutions. These spaces allow African American students to make sense of their experiences on campus and determine whether a racial microaggression has even occurred, or find support and validation for their experiential reality, and identifying alternative ways for responding to such incidents. Our second source was a study, and the title of the study is called "Critical Race Theory, Racial Microaggressions, and Campus Racial Climate: The Experience of African American College Students." This study was based on African American students attending 3 different elite universities in the United States, 2 public and 1 private, a total of 34 African American students, 18 females, and 16 males. The results from the study on microaggressions within academic spaces showed several things. So, one, experiences of being a part of certain ethnic groups were often misrepresented in their course curriculum, so often omitted, distorted, or stereotyped. Students expressing concerns in regards to professors not acknowledging racism while in class discussions, as well as students recognizing experiences where professors and faculty held lower expectations towards them.
Another source, called Critical Race Theory, Racial Microaggressions, and Campus Racial Climate for Latina/Latino undergraduates, found that some Black students changed majors, dropped classes, and even left campus to avoid racial microaggressions. It also says that a positive campus racial climate features the inclusion of students, faculty, and administrators of color, has a curriculum reflecting the historical and contemporary experiences of people of color, has programs to support recruitment, retention, and graduation of students of color, and a mission that reinforces the institution's commitment to diversify and pluralism.
So now shifting on to our own research. So we were just curious on how this related on our own campus. So what we did is that we conducted a survey that we sent around to students. So the survey asked, do you feel that CU in general is quote unquote a liberal campus? Do you feel welcome on campus? Have you experienced microaggressions on campus? How often do you think this happens in general on CU campus? Why do you rate it like that? What is your racial or ethnic identity? Why do you think in a quote unquote liberal place you still experience microaggressions? And if you feel comfortable, please give us an example of a microaggression that you have experienced. So what we found, that mainly people of color responded that yes, they think CU is liberal, but almost all of them specified on what they mean by liberal, which they all pretty much agreed on that in certain topics like environmental issues, CU is liberal, but when we talk about race, it's not so much liberal. They all feel an equal feeling of being welcome or not welcome on campus, and a lot of them again clarified what they mean, and they said, most of them said that they feel welcome in their own community, but not on campus in general. They also specified that they all have experienced microaggressions and that they think this happens on a scale from 6 to 10, which 10 being often. And when we look at what white people responded is that they said CU is very liberal. None of them really clarified except one person who literally said CU is very liberal. All of them said that they felt welcome on CU. No one clarified on what they meant. And then half of them said that they have experienced microaggressions, but then they failed to mention how. 2 did clarify it was because they were women or that they weren't straight. But then the rest just kind of mentioned that things that they heard, but that wasn't the question. The question was, have they experienced microaggressions? And they all rated that they think this happens on a scale from 1 to 8, so 1 being not at all.
In our findings, we discovered that our research is biased because the survey is not an accurate representation of the campus. The sample size was small and wasn't random or anonymous. It consisted of people we know. Response bias, which is the tendency for participants to respond inaccurately or falsely to questions, also played a role in the survey being biased. Because people were not anonymous and they are people we know, it is possible that they could have responded in a way that they believed we wanted them to respond in. Despite of this, we were able to conclude that people of color experience microaggressions daily and struggle to find safe spaces on campus or to feel as though they belong, whereas their white counterparts don't have to worry about these things. If white people do experience microaggressions, it's often because they aren't straight, cisgender, or male.
When going back to the question of why do you think on a liberal campus people still experience microaggressions, a person of color said People have convinced themselves that Boulder is liberal, yet the liberals are the ones being racist too. Same with Obama being president. You know, once we have a black president, the US is just so progressive. The same thing happens on this campus, in which white people refuse to accept their privileges, even those who are white and queer as well. Although being queer still puts a form of oppression on people, it's not the same to the degree as a queer person of color. They are disowned by their families and from their communities too, in which that doesn't happen a lot for white people because their parents are more accepting. Yet many white queers refuse to accept that and acknowledge that they have privilege despite being oppressed too. As an example, a white person responded, "Microaggressions seem to happen a lot to others at CU, but I have a unique perspective since I'm a straight white male, so it is hard for me to know." Okay, so we're gonna start off a little discussion. So just coming back from what we heard from what the white person said, they said that because they're white and they're privileged, they don't know a lot about microaggressions, which I think reinforces the whole white privilege factor. And not only that, it kind of like loops around and then ultimately oppresses people of color as well. And it also feeds into like kind of like a color blindness. It feeds into color blindness because just because you're white and you're privileged doesn't mean that you can just forget about it. You said something really well, so you should say.
I said that it really demonstrates the privilege that people have of being able to ignore something or simply walk away from it because it doesn't apply to them, as well as them choosing not to use the platform and power that they have of being able to speak up about issues without facing any kind of consequences or repercussions for it. And I think when people do choose to use their privilege and power to speak up about things, it can be in a really insensitive way.
That ties back to our article that we used, which talks about the misrepresentation of certain cultures and how that can be offensive and fall into the microaggression. And so we got a flyer that was put around for an event called Sikh Week, and they actually had an event called the Turban Tying Day, where people could just come and learn how to tie turbans, which I think just like you said, feeds into the whole misrepresentation. Not only that, it's also a cultural appropriation because I'm sure that they use that as part of like religious purposes, and people who are probably not that religion come and tie turbans because it's cool or something like that.
I think that's also, I mean, it's not a microaggression because it could be considered a macroaggression because it's kind of like offensive towards those people who are part of that culture. Yeah.
And then also the like going back to like the safe spaces being taken over. Like I don't know if a lot of people have heard, but Fleming is going to be moved, and Fleming is really known for a safe space for people of color, and the fact that like the only safe space for people of color, CU Boulder, is like, let me just move this somewhere else, is just kind of taking advantage.
And I think not only that, but I think the fact that they're gonna like remodel that building for the education. Yeah, for the education building, and then just kick like Sassy and McNeil to like another old building instead of like, why not support those minorities?
Just it really shows how people of color have to fight to keep their spaces on campus, and how it's really difficult for people of color to have their own spaces without white people invading it, which was something that some of the comments on the quiz or on the survey asked.
Yeah, a lot of topics that we did want to talk about pretty much were covered in the comments by people of color. And
I just wanted to say that the finalist for the CU president really shows how not liberal CU Boulder is. Like, it may appear to be liberal, but then the reality is that the people in the higher ups are gonna vote somebody in that's gonna,
Only